And liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
73 seconds in, and boom. The world will forever remember the massive explosion of the Challenger spaceflight that promptly ended the lives of its 7-person crew. As the ashes fell into the Atlantic Ocean, the American Space Agency knew that its reputation had taken a permanent hit. Now, new evidence about the last words of the Challenger crew has revealed something even more sinister about the launch day. Rekindling the romance with space. For America, space was nothing short of a romance. With the moon landing, the love affair had reached a new era altogether. The Apollo missions were an incredible milestone for the nation, but by the mid-'80s, the Americans were struggling to find relevance in space ventures once again. In particular, NASA wanted to keep its program alive. The agency decided to turn space exploration into a public relations affair. The biggest challenge was to keep the people's curiosity alive, and by extension, the government money and interest would keep rolling in. By January of 1986, the American Space Agency had gauged that America was super bored of space flights and unmanned missions. After all, for a good part of the decade, NASA had emphasized making space visitation a common man's dream. To do so, it kicked off the '80s by debuting its space shuttle program that reusable vehicles are going to make space exploration cheap and frequent. Think about planning a Disneyland trip. Sure, it is expensive and requires a lot of logistical work, but once in a year or so, it isn't a far-fetched dream. The idea here was to make sustainable spacecraft that would make space exploration a leisure activity rather than just some scientific venture. It was proposed that the agency would send 50 flights annually. Much to the agency's disappointment, even the idea of an accessible spaceflight didn't exactly garner a lot of support. Many Americans had seen the moon landing. For young adults, the trajectory of their life had begun with the event that had captured global attention. Not to mention, even after the moon landing, the Apollo missions continued for a bit. It also seemed that the accessible space program seemed too good to be true. Then came along the orbiter named Challenger, which was scheduled to deploy a communications satellite and study the Halley's Comet. Routine stuff, right? Well, no, not really. You see, other than the NASA, the Challenger was also taking a civilian into space. This is why the deployment of the Challenger had turned into a public event on January 28, 1986. The entire nation was glued to its television. Children in school and college had special screens installed so they could witness the launch. Then there were people who were standing right off the coast of Cape Canaveral, Florida, to witness the Challenger taking off from its launch site. After years of struggle, the space agency was able to create a public spectacle. There was no doubt that the American nation had rekindled its romance with space, thanks to a school teacher who had merely hoped to see space. It is just deeply unfortunate that the blissful story of national pride and dreams coming true was turned into a tragedy, and it only took 73 seconds. Teachers in Space program. The 7-person crew of the flight included payload specialist Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher and mother of 2 who had applied to the agency's Teachers in Space program. President Ronald Reagan in 1984 had declared it to inspire students, celebrate teachers, and spark interest in mathematics, science, and space exploration. The idea was to train the selected teacher as a payload specialist, who would take a very valuable lesson to their class after the flight was concluded. After a rigorous process, the agency chose Krista McAuliffe. Krista had planned 2 15-minute lessons that she would deliver from the space shuttle. Just for Challenger alone, NASA had mailed 40,000 applications to prospective teachers all across America. By the end of the deadline, it had received 11,000 filled applications. So needless to say, the process was highly selective and thorough. When Krista was chosen to take the flight, she was over the moon. Her family and students knew that going to space was a dream of hers. And in the months following the launch of Challenger, she trained rigorously. In many ways, as a civilian, Krista was a public relations catnip for the space agency and the American government. Many people speculated that Reagan's plan definitely gave new life to the space exploration program, but it was merely a tokenistic measure to justify funneling billions of dollars into the agency agency. No matter what the real intentions of the government were, the impact of onboarding Krista for Challenger was pretty visceral. She was the definite proof for the Americans that taking civilians to space wasn't too good to be true. It was a plausible reality for thousands of Americans. An average American could make it to a space shuttle without being a hotshot fighter with fancy science degrees. For children, the immediate message was that dreams do come true. With these sentiments in the hearts of Americans, the Teachers in Space project was heartwarmingly beautiful. However, as you know, the Challenger was never a success story as NASA had hoped it to be. As much as the nation was excited for Krista to make it to space, it was equally heartbroken when the space shuttle exploded mid-flight. This is why the space agency canceled the program in 1990. 8 years later, the program was replaced with the Educator Astronaut Project, which was centered around participants becoming mission specialists for their flights. The Teachers in Space program also came under fire for being pretty non-transparent about the deployment details. For instance, the Challenger flight had already depicted the risk of being a failure even before its launch date was decided. People skeptical of the program had noticed that perhaps it wasn't easy for civilians like Krista to fully understand the details mentioned in the preliminary reports of the flight. However, the truth of the matter was that other than the school teacher, 6 other people had manned the crew too. Were these people oblivious to the issues that had plagued the flight? Or did NASA deliberately hide the protocols from the crew? The investigation of the explosion was always muddy and subjected to a lot of conspiracy theories. However, there was one thing for sure. The space agency had been hasty with the deployment, and for the most part, it had written off the terrible fate of the Challenger and its crew. The complicated history of the Challenger. In April 1983, Challenger became the second shuttle to reach space. Before it was ridden with disaster, it successfully completed 9 milestone missions in nearly 3 years of its deployment. So to give you an exact figure, the Challenger had spent 62 days, 7 hours, 56 minutes, and 22 seconds in space. Other than its longevity in space, the shuttle was special for other reasons too. It had hosted the first spacewalk of the agency's space shuttle program back on April 7, 1983. It had also carried the first American female and African American astronauts into space, a feat that the Apollo missions had severely lacked. All in all, the Challenger was a good luck charm for America. It made all the sense to turn it into the vehicle of people's dreams. That was not always its fate, though. Believe it or not, NASA had made the Challenger a test vehicle. It was never supposed to carry out the feat that it was scheduled to do in 1986. Rockwell International had begun building the spacecraft in 1975. 3 years later, Lockheed Martin did structural testing on the Challenger, and what the agency found out was nothing short of concerning. You see, according to the agency itself, there were certain issues in the spacecraft that were hard to ignore. In a document published by the agency, it explicitly mentioned that the computer models in 1978 were not developed enough to carry out stress testing on the Challenger during various modes of flight. The spacecraft was approved anyway. By 1981, Rockwell had carried out several tests on the Challenger to turn it into a spacecraft. The effort took a lot of time, but the American Space Agency was committed. It was noted that the workers at Rockwell had to do a lot to strengthen the spacecraft's wings. This is probably why the conversion process took more time than expected. However, NASA was also desperate. It had scheduled flights for the Challenger while it was still in the conversion process. According to the official timeline, it was expected to go into space on January 20th, 1983 to release the first ever tracking and data relay satellite. It was the same system of satellites that astronauts would use to stay in touch with the controllers back home. However, the technical issues in the Challenger wouldn't stop coming in. For many engineers working on the craft, it was a miracle that it was able to take its April 1983 flight. Initially, the American Space Agency discovered a hydrogen leak in the #1 main engine aft compartment during a test flight in December. If that wasn't enough, in January of 1983, the engineers discovered major cracks in the engine that were causing the leak. For the following months, NASA did major tests on the main engine of the spacecraft. They were confident that the first and second engines were completely functioning, but had to replace the main engine. Eventually, after some band-aids and risks, the Challenger was launched into space, and astronauts Story Musgrave and Donald Peterson executed the first spacewalk of the shuttle program. Thankfully, no major accidents happened. happened. Considering the complicated history of the engine, the mission proved itself to be worthy. Another feat came the following year. In April 1984, Challenger took another journey to space, this time to feature the very first astronaut repair of a satellite. Yet that wasn't only the wow factor of Challenger's deployment. In order to get to the non-functional Solar Maximum mission satellite, astronaut George Nelson successfully used the Manned Maneuvering Unit. The space agency had built the jet-powered backpack so the astronauts could easily fly in space. While the Manned Maneuvering Unit had been used before once, it was Nelson's fix-it trip that would be turned into a success story. By the time of this mission, Nelson had proved that the Challenger was a worthy contender for the space agency's space shuttle program. Despite its complicated malfunctioning history and several engine failures, it seemed like it had redeemed itself. The missions in 1983 and 1984 had eased the space agency's worries, but of course, what happened next was just simply unacceptable. The day of explosion. It was a very chilly morning on January 28, 1986, but the American nation didn't pay much heed to it. Everyone woke up early and made time to watch the Challenger's 10th mission, which was carrying Mission Commander Francis Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, and Ellison Onizuka, and payload specialists Gregory Jarvis and Christina McAuliffe. The crew was about to take the flight of their lifetime when temperatures dipped below the freezing point. The Challenger engineers were worried that the integrity of the seals on the solid rocket boosters could be compromised in low temperatures. Their concerns were ignored. After all, NASA had a lot at stake. Since the public was largely involved in the event, they had to show that they delivered on promises, even if they ended up risking the lives of 7 people and billions of dollars of taxpayer money. So it was a no-brainer that the Challenger would take the flight. At 11:38 in the morning Eastern Time, the Challenger began its one-way journey. Everyone watched as the flight took its course, and people cheered for Christa McAuliffe to fulfill a common man's dream, to witness the wonders of space. All eyes were on the Challenger. After years, an American space mission had the undivided attention of news outlets from all over the world. By all measures, Florida was brimming with hope and optimism. Then, it all vanished. Children watched the live news as the Challenger exploded into white dust and ashes 73 seconds after the launch. It felt like the world had stopped. For the first time ever in the history of the NASA, a space shuttle broke apart while it was still in the launch process. The space agency's commentator tried to console the viewers and assured them that their engineers were looking into the major malfunction. The commentator's exact words are stitched into the minds of the viewers who had tuned into the live feed. He said,
"Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction."
Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously, a major malfunction. People didn't need any expert opinion, though. The imagery of the disaster told them everything they needed to know. In a split second, a major chunk of the space shuttle went flying into the Atlantic Ocean. There and then, the Challenger disintegrated into thousands of pieces. Viewers who witnessed the launch live could see small pieces of the spacecraft taking a deep dive into the ocean. In the weeks following the disaster, salvage crews and rescue operations recovered the pieces of the shuttle as well as the remains of the 7 astronauts. Not all and everyone was found, though. Whatever the crew could collect was handed over to the families of the 7 unlucky astronauts. The rest of the unidentifiable remains were buried in a monument to the Challenger crew, located in the Arlington National Cemetery. The monument came about on May 20th, 1986. For days to come, the television screens were full of images of the 7 astronauts and the Y-shaped explosion that was entrenched into the minds of the public. Everyone was just in sheer disbelief. At the same time, when the public mourned, the American government and its space agency grappled to find answers. What had happened? Why were the relentless warnings of the engineers ignored? Above all, who was to blame for the death of 7 people? What we found changed the course of space exploration forever. The Rogers Commission. The immediate aftermath of the disaster was the formation of a presidential commission led by former Secretary of State William Rogers. This is why the investigation tribunal came to be known as the Rogers Commission. In the months that followed the explosion, the commission went through every single inch of what was left of Challenger, and of course, the investigation began from the very agency that had green-signaled its launch. That was the first time when the public learned that the launch day was nothing but a facade. What we watched on television television was a majestic launch, but behind the scenes, the situation was almost death-like. In the videos captured by the space agency, which never made their way to television, the Rogers Commission saw black smoke coming out of the bottom of the right solid rocket booster. The public never saw the smoke. The video of the shuttle's flight showed that there was nothing risky to see. Within 60 seconds of the burning, we saw the flames that engulfed the crew. As the rocket kept moving, the flame kept growing bigger and bigger. Eventually, it engulfed the big orange fuel tank by the slipstream too. It seemed like by the time engineers saw the leak, it was too late. The flight was already in mid-air. However, data from the ground of the Challenger showed that there was a definite leak in the booster, but it was too late to do anything about it. How could one abort a space shuttle when it had taken off? According to news reports published by Space.com and other sources, the flame eventually burned through the shuttle's external tank, rupturing the liquid hydrogen tank milliseconds before the right booster crashed into the liquid oxygen tank. The two liquids mixed and exploded, destroying the orbiter with it. There was no going back. As soon as the Challenger took off, the on-ground engineers knew that it was never going to make its way back. Later, it was revealed to the public that the biggest impetus behind the explosion was the freezing cold temperature on the day of the launch. The explosion was traced to a small, almost insignificant-looking part of the spacecraft, called the O-ring. While this rubber piece is tiny, it is also considered to be the biggest, potentially catastrophic part of any space shuttle. The O-ring is particularly important as it acts like the seal between sections of the solid rocket boosters. So, being an external part, it is sensitive to a number of factors, including harsh weather conditions such as extremely low temperatures. The American nation was shocked to learn that the O-ring was only functional in temperatures above 53 degrees. In temperatures below that threshold, it would lose all of its functionality, and well, people remembered shivering in the cold on the day of the launch. Many weather reports cited that the temperature on the launch pad on the unfortunate morning was 36 degrees. So in such a low temperature, the O-ring had lost all of its elasticity, causing the leak. 5 months after the disaster, popular theoretical physicist Dr. Richard Feynman showed the public how exactly the shuttle caught fire. On live television, he brought a small piece of an O-ring, twisted it, and dipped it into the ice-cold water. When he took the ring out, it wouldn't go back to its original shape, meaning it was completely dysfunctional. There was no question that the space agency was aware of the temperature discrepancies. After all, one of the senior engineers of the shuttle had told them exactly what would happen if they continued with the launch. "It is going to blow up," he had said. The warning of Bob Ebeling. As the Rogers Commission continued briefing the public on the explosion, it became increasingly clear that the space agency had green-signaled the launch despite the unfavorable temperature. In the midst of the chaos, the space agency took another hit on its so-called credibility when National Public Radio published the accounts of two engineers who had informed their superiors about the explosion that was about to happen. In two separate interviews, which consisted of a lot of crying and grieving, the engineers had said that the issue about the O-rings was identified way before the launch, but their concerns were dismissed. In 1986, the identity of these engineers was kept confidential for legal reasons. However, on the 30th anniversary of the explosion, the National Public Radio revealed the identity of one of the engineers. Bob Ebeling had told the news agency that the night before the launch, he and 4 other engineers had tried to stop the launch while working at the NASA's contractor, Morton Thiokol, in Utah. The space agency was moving forward with the coldest launch in its history, and the tests done at Morton Thiokol revealed that the rubber proofing of the shuttle would not survive the very cold temperatures. When Bob tried to take his superiors in Florida on board, he was shut down immediately. The night before the launch was very hard for him, and he had told his wife Darlene that the Challenger would blow up. That was the exact statement he had given to his bosses, but was overruled. Even then, Bob and his fellow concerned engineers had hoped for the safe return of the 7-people crew that was about to risk their lives for the very agency that was about to undermine them. When the Challenger exploded 73 seconds after the launch, Bob and his colleagues were stunned and grief-stricken, but even before the Rogers Commission could start the investigation, the engineers knew what had exactly happened. To this date, Bob remembers the data on the test report that had shown that the O-ring would malfunction, and the leak would engulf the shuttle into a blazing fire. The worst part is that Bob blames himself for the death of the 7 astronauts. In a recent interview with National Public Radio, he revealed that he still wishes that he would have fought harder to stop his bosses from going forward with the launch. He stated that there was no issue in delaying the launch for another day or two, but for some reason, the space agency was staunch in following the set schedule. No one, including the Rogers Commission and Bob, could understand why that was the case. In the words of Bob Ebeling, they had their mind set on going up and proving to the world they were right and they knew what they were doing, but they didn't. Bob acknowledged that his bosses had a lot at stake, but nothing justified risking precious lives. Soon after the crash of the Challenger, Bob became so depressed that he decided to leave his job. Nothing could convince him that the space agency wasn't aware of the big risks it was taking. If the space agency knew that the low temperatures would be fatal for the Challenger, why did it approve of the launch? The case of poor decision-making. Ultimately, the Rogers Commission concluded that a serious flaw in the decision-making process leading up to the launch was something that implicated the NASA. However, engineers at Morton Thiokol had warned the agency multiple times, but none of it mattered in front of the public relations that it was trying to win. The space agency was hyper-focused on the reusability of the space shuttle program. That sort of claim was coupled with the idea that spaceflight would be synonymous with air travel. Sure, there will be some delays here and there, but it would largely be a safe venture. The entire plan was dependent on the functionality of the refurbished orbiters, like the Challenger. Delaying the launch would have forced the space agency to acknowledge that perhaps the reusability of the spacecraft wasn't its strongest suit. Not to mention, the agency was also trying to send a message that space exploration itself would become considerably cheap as more and more missions were booked and executed safely. However, despite making some big claims, the agency struggled considerably. 5 years after the inaugural launch, the world only witnessed 5 missions per year, which was a pretty lowball number compared to the promises that the agency had made. There were only 4 orbiters that could do the job, and between the missions, it took a lot of time to refurbish them. Since the American Space Agency was pretty hasty about the schedule, it was very likely that it would also ignore major issues that were flagged by its engineers. That's exactly what happened to the Challenger in 1986. At that point, the only success of the Space Shuttle program was perhaps to fill in the diversity gap in the NASA. Challenger itself had given opportunities to scientists, people of color, women, and even civilians to make something out of themselves. These measures were only of limited interest, though. We have already talked about how the teachers in Space Project had given new life to the space agency. Against the backdrop of that hype, the Challenger was already delayed twice. The original mission was supposed to fly in 1985, but it had several technical issues. Some more issues grappled with the schedule. Ultimately, it was decided that the launch would occur in 1986 to maintain the "A teacher is going to space" hype. So, the space agency made technical decisions accordingly. Before the flight, certain satellites and science payloads on board had to be deployed. Since these technical considerations were made prior to the flight, the space agency didn't consider changing the plan at all. Everything was settled, and it was time to make sure that the Challenger did what it had to do on a random Tuesday. In the end, the public relations campaign had won, and what was left were the last bone-chilling words of the crew. The final words of the Challenger crew. The biggest mystery around the crash was the question of whether the crew, especially the flight commander and pilot, knew anything about the risky preliminary testing. There was only one way to make that deduction: to carefully analyze the recording of the crew's conversation mid-flight. By the looks of it, it seemed like no crew member other than pilot Michael Smith noticed anything abnormal about the flight. Unfortunately, Michael only made his observation at the 73rd second of the fight, a microsecond before the shuttle exploded, and ground controllers lost all communication with the craft. Before the flight went into flames, the crew was having a light-hearted conversation. Laughter was heard, and jokes were made. At one point, Michael even marveled at the flight as he said, "Go you, mother." Previously, it was believed that the last known words from the Challenger came from Commander Francis Scobie, who was also known by his nickname Dick. His last recorded words were his conversation with the ground controllers when he responded with "Roger, go at throttle up." Francis had confirmed that the shuttle's main engines had been raised to full power. Everything was going according to plan. However, that wasn't the end. In a harrowing moment, the American Space Agency realized that the pilot of the shuttle, Michael, had taken note of their impending doom. This is why the last words of the crew came from him when he uttered a final "uh-oh" at the 73rd second of the flight. Then everything came crashing down. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.